Congressman Peter King stirs up emotion again, this time among New York's Muslim community. As Deborah Alfarone reports, Congressman King defies political correctness and stands behind his statements.
He promised to bring up issues that some could say are politically incorrect, and today Republican Congressman Peter King did just that. He talked to us today on the phone from D.C.
Unfortunately, the leadership in the Muslim community, for whatever reason, does not want to cooperate, does not want to even, in many cases, denounce the terrible attacks that have taken place.
The man who will become the chairman of the House Homeland Security Committee says he plans to open a congressional inquiry into what he calls the radicalization of the Muslim community. King points to Najib al-Azazi, arrested last year for plotting to bomb the New York City subway system.
He was homegrown. He had no terror activity that we knew of, but he was recruited here in this country to work for al-Qaeda. And in that case, there was an imam who actually the police thought was cooperative. The police asked the imam for information, and instead the imam tipped off Zazi, and Zazi almost got away.
I think Peter King needs to realize that Muslims are the biggest asset that Americans have in the fight against terrorism.
Dahlia Mahmood heads up the New York chapter of the Muslim Public Affairs Council. She says this latest charge amounts to racial profiling.
Racial profiling of any group is never justified. He needs to work with us and recognize that we have been and will continue to be partners with law enforcement, and that is the quickest win for him.
Now, we have to forget this nonsense of political correctness. We have to face reality. The reality is that the terror threat is coming from radical Muslims. The overwhelming majority of Muslims are good, outstanding Americans. But the fact is there is an element in the Muslim community which is intent on attacking the United States and destroying us.
King says he plans to open that hearing early next year. Deborah Alfarone, Pix 11 News.
A new battle is shaping up in the fight against Islamic extremism, and it is about to take center stage on Capitol Hill. Congressman Peter King, soon to be chairman of the House Homeland Security Committee, and he has announced that he is set to hold hearings on the radicalization of American Muslims, looking for answers as to what is driving homegrown terrorism. New York Republican Pete King is my guest now. Congressman, thanks so much for being here. So no sooner do you announce that you're going to do this than you've got groups like CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, coming out and saying this is going to be an anti-Muslim witch hunt. It's going to be a new McCarthy-type hearing era. And you say what to CARE and others like them?
Well, I'm certainly not going to be intimidated by CARE. I'm going to go ahead with the hearings. And the fact is that we have to break through this politically correct nonsense, which keeps us from debating and discussing what I think is one of the most vital issues in this country, that we are under siege by Muslim terrorists, and yet there are Muslim leaders in this country who do not cooperate with law enforcement. We have the reality that al-Qaeda is trying to recruit Muslim Americans, and yet we have people in the Muslim community who refuse to face up to this and will not cooperate with the FBI or police or whatever. And we have this growing threat, and there's any number of recent cases where young Muslims in this country have been drawn to terrorism. And that does not affect the entire Muslim community, but it is a reflection on their leaders who will not cooperate with law enforcement. Megan, if I can give you one quick example. There was a number of Muslim parents who went to law enforcement because their sons were being recruited to be suicide bombers in Somalia. The FBI began an investigation, and yet imams in the mosques involved instructed their members not to cooperate with the investigation. Now, that to me is indefensible, and the real victims here, obviously all Americans are victims, potential victims, but the immediate victims are Muslims themselves, whose sons and daughters can end up being killed as suicide bombers.
How do you get past that, though, by holding hearings? I mean, how does Congress, sitting there listening to the testimony of experts, get past that sort of edict, that directive from imams?
By, I think, bringing it out into the open, and also, the overwhelming majority of Muslims are outstanding people. By letting it be known to them how their leaders, in many cases, are selling them out, are putting them in a very awkward, a terrible position, and to encourage the Muslim community itself to speak out, to work with police, to work with law enforcement, to look within their own communities, because the recent attacks in the United States, you had Zazi, he was going to attack the New York City subway system. He was raised in the United States. He was living here legally. We had Shahzad, the Times Square bomber,
Faisal
a U.S.
Shahzad.
citizen, living legally, yes. So these are all, Major Hassan, who murdered 13 people at Fort Hood. These are all Americans living here legally. And that's the reality, is Al-Qaeda is recruiting them, whether it's Al-Qaeda core or whether it's Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. They're recruiting Americans who are living here legally because we've done an excellent job of stopping Al-Qaeda from attacking us from overseas. But so now they're recruiting within, so it's more important than ever that we get to the root of why there's this alienation. Also, a poll just 2 years ago, the Pew poll, said that 15% of Muslim men living in the United States between 18 and 29 would support suicide bombing. We're talking about tens of thousands of potential
How did we
people
get to that
who
point?
potentially support suicide bombing.
How did we get to that
How
point?
did we
that
get
Pew
that?
poll, because you cite that in your op-ed, is really shocking.
Yeah, this is something I think it's evolved over the years, and the American media, American politicians, the inside elite refuse to discuss this issue. When someone like myself says, let's raise this issue, let's talk about it, right away I'm denounced as a bigot, as a McCarthyite. You go through the whole list of epithets they throw at me. And part of it is, I think, for too many years, liberals wanted to believe that George Bush was the cause of terrorism, and that once Bush and Cheney were gone, things would be fine. And there was just this reluctance to face the reality of what's happening. I mean, you see what's happened in Britain. We've seen what happened in other countries where the attacks, the most recent attacks in those countries, have been carried out by second and third generation Muslims living in the country. And I keep using the word Muslim. In a way, it bothers me because I work with Muslim leaders, and I try to discuss this issue with them. They're good people, but they just don't seem to appreciate the necessity of why they should be coming forward and why they should be working more with law enforcement.
Right. Certainly that's true of some and not of others. But let me ask you, Congressman, because you
Right.
mentioned, and you talk about this in your piece that you've written today as well, how you've been denounced as a bigot because you want to look into this. And more and more we've seen that in the past, I don't know, year and a half in this country, that if you call attention to, a policy that's potentially discriminatory, you're the bigot. Or if you say something derogatory about Muslims as opposed to specifying radical Muslims, like Bill O'Reilly did, he was denounced as a bigot, even though he had a broader point he was trying to make. Does it bother you?
No, because it bothers me that people feel that way, but it doesn't bother me personally. I have a job to do, and I've seen enough that I think I have to do this job. I've seen too many incidents where lives could have been lost and will be lost, and I have the responsibility and the obligation. I'll do it, and what happens, happens.
Congressman Pete King will be covering those hearings as you proceed forward as the new chairman of the House Homeland Security Committee. We appreciate you being here. Merry Christmas, sir.
Megan, thank you as always. You too, Megan.
All the best.